Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for being here today. My name is Amy Bryant with Parenting Beyond Punishment and Wild Child Counseling, and I'm here today with our final interview for our No Spank Challenge, and I'm here with two very special people, Robbyn Bennett of StopSpanking.org and Dr. Elizabeth Gershoff, who has just published this latest article on research. And I'm so excited that she is going to be speaking with all of us today. And before I introduce them completely, I just want to let you know we do have a chat box on the side. We encourage you to ask questions there. There's a Q&A button that you can click on the bottom, which will help us find your questions. Also, if you experience technical difficulties, try refreshing your browser, or you can sign out and sign back on. That'll be the best way to sort of solve your technical difficulties. So now I just would like to introduce Robbyn, and she's going to take it from here. Thanks for being here. Hi, Robbyn.
Great. Hey, Amy, it's great to be here. It's good to be here with Dr. Gershoff. It's an honor, really. Dr. Gershoff has been studying the effects of corporal punishment for 20 years. She's been chasing the question of, really what effect does spanking actually have on children in all of the ways that we spank children. And she is the Associate Professor of Human Development and Family Sciences at the University of Texas, Austin, and she's also a mother of 2 children. And just welcome, Dr. Gershoff. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Robbyn.
Yeah. So I thought it sounds like, so Amy's going to sort of watch the comment section and let us know if people have any questions. So I'll just start talking about some of the things I'm interested in with your science, and we'll go from there.
Sounds great.
So the first question is, particularly if you're following this topic, is why another study at this point?
That's an excellent question. I did another meta-analysis back in 2002 that got a fair amount of attention. And back then I thought, okay, this is it. We have all the research. We don't need any more research on this. But questions remained, both in the public and in the research world. And so my colleague Andy Grogan-Kaler and I decided to do another meta-analysis. And we really wanted to address 2 kind of nagging questions. One was, are the effects that we see of spanking really from the harsh methods? Because in my first analysis, I included things like people hitting children with objects. The reason I included that is because 1 in 4 parents to this day still uses objects to hit children. Mm. If 1 in 4 parents are doing something, that seems like it's normative. It may not be something we like, but it's how parents are defining it. But I could understand why people thought that was not good to include. So this new analysis takes out anything that involves hitting with objects or anything that looks really like it could cause injury, so kicking or beating or obviously biting or things like that. So anything harsh we took out. We looked really just kind of basic physical punishment, basic spanking. And so we took all of the research we could find from the last 50 years and found 75 studies that looked at some form of spanking. And we took their research and averaged it and included how many kids were in each study, because that gives us a sense of how strong that effect is. And then looked at the average effect for 17 different outcomes. And I realize I'm getting into the effects, and you really wanted to know more just about why. But
that's okay. You can just finish your sentence, and then I'll just back up and go, whoa, I'm back here still. It's fine.
That's right. And so, our main goal was to see, is spanking achieving what parents want? Parents' main goals when spanking are to improve children's behavior in the short term and to increase their better behavior in the long run. And so we wanted to see, is that true? And that's why we did this meta-analysis.
Okay. Well, so that's great, because that's the question that we're often hearing is, there's a lot of good parents out there that spank children, that really love their children.
Oh, sure.
And parent them very well in many, many ways, and that take parenting very seriously and would be extremely offended by anyone abusing a child and would be child abuse advocates even. So when the news hit, it said that one of them, I think the Boston Globe, said that spanking is similar to child abuse in terms of the negative outcomes. So that's a pretty shocking thing for good parents to hear. And so what I'm wondering is, did your research help So one of the arguments would be that many parents are not explosive or what we call dysregulated or spanking in anger. They spank in a methodical way. They're rational. They have a whole sort of idea about why they do it. And of course, Dr. Dobson often talks about not hitting in anger. Does your research differentiate between this kind of like overwhelmed parent hitting a child versus a parent who's using it as a very clear disciplinary tool?
Well, there's a lot to get into with that comment. So for our study specifically, this new study, we didn't differentiate between those kinds of hitting in anger versus hitting not in anger. That's not what we were doing. The questions basically ask, how often do you spank your child? So spank is our main outcome. And then the physical abuse items are things like, did you get an injury? Did the child have to go to the hospital because of an injury related to the physical punishment? And so that kind of crosses the line into physical abuse.
Right.
And so, we didn't differentiate between that kind of what we call in the research, what we call instrumental spanking. So spanking for a clear purpose, possibly without a lot of emotion, which is problematic in its own way, versus kind of the more emotional hitting when angry.
Yeah.
I think, if people thought about it, a lot of the spanking happens when they're angry. And that it's not. There was a really interesting clip that I saw that Joan Durant sent around yesterday of a newscaster in New Zealand who said that she had been really in favor of spanking before she had kids. And then when she had kids, she realized the times that she wanted to spank her child, it was not when the child was misbehaving. It was when she was at her wit's end. She was the one who was really upset. And she stopped. And so I don't know that you could really, it's hard to differentiate for me between the anger levels of parents when they're spanking. I think, to me, that's almost beside the point. Because hitting is hitting. And in any other relationship, hitting is hitting. And it doesn't really matter if you hit somebody really hard if you were angry or not.
Right.
We don't really ask if a husband hit a wife when he was angry or not. We don't ask if somebody punched somebody in a bar and they weren't angry. I mean, we don't ask those questions, but for some reason we ask that when we're talking about parents and children.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is.
And it's partly because of the education that's been offered around spanking. It makes that a criteria and then somehow allows it, sort of puts it in a different light, like this is different than hitting because you're not angry or that kind of thing. What about frequency? Because other parents will say, I rarely use spanking, and so I just don't think a tap on the bottom is that big of a deal, and that your research is probably looking at parents that are kind of compulsive spankers or that kind of thing.
Well, so half of the studies we looked at are looking at people who ever spanked. So it's just comparing ever or not. So it would capture all those people who just do it once or twice a year, or even once or twice in a child's life. And we still are finding that spanking is linked to these negative outcomes. What I would say to parents who are hitting only once or twice, that if you're only hitting once or twice, you probably don't need to be doing it at all. You have other methods that you're using all the time. And so when it looks like spanking is working, it's because we are doing all these other things with our children that do work, using positive discipline and talking with children about why they should behave appropriately. Those are the things that are teaching children to behave. And if they do learn those lessons, it's not because of the spanking, it's in spite of it.
Right. Yeah. So, and so the parents that are doing it rarely, they also might be using it as a way to instill fear. So that's kind of a pervasive sort of style. And it sounds like they're in your study so that the outcomes are still showing that even that isn't good. Can you say something about the outcomes? The negative outcomes?
So we looked at 17 different outcomes. Most of them were in childhood, a few were in adulthood. And we found that 13 of them were statistically significant, and all of them were in the direction of a negative outcome for children. We found that spanking was not linked with better compliance. It just wasn't related to compliance at all. And in the short term, like immediately.
Right.
And then everything else was looking at kind of longer-term outcomes of spanking. So children are not better behaved in the long run. They're not more pro-social. They're not kind of empathic. They're not kind of the positive things that parents want their children to be doing. They're not doing more of that. The more children are spanked, the more aggressive they are, and that's a pretty clear lesson. Children are learning that you can use aggression to get what you want. They have more antisocial. so they have more behavior problems. They also have more mental health problems like depression or anxiety. They have worse relationships with their parents. And then the main serious one we found in childhood was the link with this higher risk for physical abuse.
So that it links up with child abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And again, it doesn't mean that everybody who spanks abuse. I mean, in this country, I should say, in other countries, any kind of spanking is considered abuse. In the United States, we don't consider spanking abuse, so we have drawn this kind of arbitrary line.
Right.
And so in this country, not everybody who spanks abuses their children. That's definitely not the case. It's just that it makes it more likely. And when we look at cases of parents who have physically abused their children, 75% of them started out as discipline. So they've been found to have physically abused their child, and the investigators go and say, what happened? And they say, well,
right.
He kept bothering me. I was talking on the phone, and I just wanted him to shut up, and,
It escalated.
It escalated. And so the most tragic part about that is the parent is not a sick parent. They're not a crazy parent. They're just a frustrated parent, and all of us become frustrated at times. And they got carried away. They just hit for too long or too hard, or they used an object and it injured their child. And that was not their intention. Their intention was to discipline.
So in a way, it's like the hitting itself. I always say it dysregulates the parent too, because as soon as you hit, you have to see the child as a threat. So it totally changes the way your brain is functioning, and it disconnects you empathically from the child. So of course you're more likely to lose control, and then you get more and more dysregulated because you're relating to your child as a threat. I want to ask you, in terms of, so people that don't understand science the way you do, having studied it and research, we get a lot of questions when we're trying to share the science that are difficult to answer. Like, for example, the one we hear a lot, and Aaron here on the chat session here is talking about it. What is the difference? We know that this research is correlative and that it's not causational, so we can't say that spanking's causing all these negative outcomes. So how do you help parents who are still thinking that kind of this research might be biased, or it might be kind of not taking into consideration other variables of maybe families that aren't doing other things for the children that they should be doing?
Okay, so again, there's a lot to unpack there. So it's true that correlation is not causation. People like to say that. That's definitely not true. Right. But what is true is that correlation is the first necessary step for causation. You have to establish that two things are related to each other before you can show that one causes the other. So this is the first step. We're just saying these two things are very, very strongly related to each other. In 99% of the studies where we found a statistically significant effect, we found a negative effect. I shouldn't say effect, I should say a negative outcome was associated with spanking. So none of the studies, basically one study, found a positive outcome. And that was a weird study that looked at guys in the army in the 1970s stationed in Germany, and asked them if they had less opioid use, and they had less opioid use if they reported being spanked as a child. So okay, that's great for those guys, but that's a very unique example, very unique situation. When we're talking about the rest of the studies, we're not finding any positive outcomes linked with spanking. So if spanking were good, okay, if spanking did work, we should find all the associations the other direction. We should find that it's associated with more compliance and less aggression and more better relationships with parents and less mental health problems. We don't see that. All the outcomes are in the other direction. So I think people seem to think that I'm out there looking for bad outcomes, and I'm always looking for the good ones. They just don't ever come out. They're always coming out in the opposite direction. What else was I going to say about that? The other issue is, of course, we can't do experiments with children. We can't randomly assign children. My university will not allow me to randomly assign children to be hit or not.
Right. That's good. That's a good thing.
Yeah, good for my university. Not that I'd even try, but they wouldn't allow me to do it. We also can't randomly assign children to parents. Like, that's unethical. We can't do that. So, of course, people who spank are going to be slightly different than people who aren't spanking, and that could cause, other things. We also know parents do many other things to discipline their children, not just spank them. We can't include every possible variable in our analyses, but we've done a few things to try to get closer to a causal conclusion. And this is not in the meta-analysis, but I can tell you about some other research that I've done. So one of the main questions that I often get is, are the children who are being spanked the most the ones who are the most difficult. And so they are eliciting more spanking. And so it looks like spanking is causing the behavior when really
There's a cycle.
When the behavior is causing it. And some people think that it's more, we call that a child effect in the research. The child is affecting the parent's behavior.
Okay.
And so some people argue, well, it's all child effect. And what I've found in several studies is that both things are true. There is a child effect, yes. If children are poorly behaved, parents are more likely to spank them in the future because they're just frustrated with them.
Yes.
But even when you take that into account in the analyses, there's still a relationship between spanking at one time and an increase in aggression later on, and behavior problems. So in those kind of analyses, we can tease apart that relationship between spanking and kids' behavior and show that even if you know how aggressive they are to begin with, it still increases aggression. And I have several rounds of analyses that I'm still working on writing up right now for publication. But in one of them, we found that was true no matter what level of aggression the kids start with, both for the kids who start in very low aggression, the kids who start really high in aggression, all of them increase over time in aggression.
Yeah.
And so it's not working for anybody.
Well, I wonder, children that are really dysregulated, that's kind of the kids I see, the kids that are quite oppositional, right? And of course, the way we treat these children is we really try to eliminate all punishment and really work on attachment so that this child can co-regulate with the parent and really start to gain mastery over their arousal. I would wonder that those children might actually be more vulnerable to negative outcomes if they are hit.
Yeah, that's possible. We haven't really looked at that specific. I mean, this one analysis did look at this kind of overall. Actually, I think we did find that it was worse for the kids who had started out the highest. I think that that's true.
Because in a way, they're more vulnerable, to.
Yeah, they're more susceptible. They're obviously going in that direction already, and so.
Yeah. They already perceive threat anyway and feel out of control by it, right?
Right. Their environment is hurting them all the time, and so they do have to be very vigilant. And they tend to do what we call have a hostile attribution bias. We call in the literature that's the term for it, but it means just kind of assuming there's threat out there, that people are out to get you and don't always have your best interest at heart. Yes. And so if a child is perceiving that from a parent, that is going to interfere with the relationship. So I totally agree that getting the relationships back on track is really important for paving the way to better discipline.
Yes. Let me, it's hard to actually read the comments and listen to you. I'm not very good at multitasking, so I just want to look at them for a minute.
Okay.
Of course,
I'm not seeing the comments, so you're going to have to read them to me.
I'm happy to do it, and we're covering some of them. One is, the whole, well, and of course, this conversation is more than science, right? Mm-hmm. So I have a good friend who is comes from a very devout family, very Christian, and they are very family-oriented. They really care about children. They're very ethical people, but they are pro-spanking. She is not. And so part of her conversation is often talking about the research, but then also talking about the religious, ideology and coming from the heart and trying to share that view, and then trying to tie in the science. And I'm wondering if you could speak to what pieces of the science are really important to hang on to when you're weaving them into the deeper issue of, how do we relate to our children? And because, of course, it's very hard to change someone's mind unless they're connected to you, Mm-hmm. Logic isn't enough sometimes.
Right, exactly. I think the way to connect to people is that we all have our children's best interests at heart. I mean, I think every parent at some level has that. I mean, even parents who sometimes abuse their children often love them. And so we all, I think it's a matter of getting to that point, and if you know something is not good for your kid, why would you do it anymore? And so the science is we're trying to inform people about that it's as if, one example I like to give is that when I was a child, there was no seatbelts in our car. Like, my parents' car just didn't have seatbelts. So we didn't have seatbelts, didn't have car seats. We were just bouncing around.
Right.
And, nowadays we would think that's terrible. I mean, it's illegal to put your child in a car without a car seat. How did we get there? Well, partly through science. Science did lots of experiments to show that when people were restrained by seatbelts, they were less likely to die in car accidents. Great. So we passed laws, and people now wear seatbelts, and people are horrified if any person has a child in a car without a car seat. We've learned from the science.
Sure. However, I would say that, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I'm just saying that I think that we can change, and I think we can use that science to kind of change. If people understand it all is coming from a good place, I mean, that, this is not about judging people. This is about learning from the 160,000 people that were in our research. Yeah. We can learn from their experience, and maybe adapt our own behavior.
Yes. There was a little piece you said, it was about, I'm not going to make the link perfectly, but the thought that came into my head that I've had the conversation is, well, this science has a liberal bias. Have you heard this?
Oh,
I hear
yes,
it all the time. And so it's like, well, and I mean, people that know me know my attitude towards children is probably a more liberal perspective, but it's deeply embedded in also neurobiology, and I do try to lean into that to help them understand that. But I do appreciate that there's a little bit of a fear, like, is the science slanted? Is it I had a psychiatrist who clearly understands medicine one time say to me, oh, when I first brought this up, and goes, oh, they probably have an axe to grind.
And that's unfortunate. I mean, I think I've been struggling with that a lot, because Americans seem to not trust science for some reason, unless it goes along with their beliefs they already hold.
Yeah.
It's hard to, I mean, there's still people who think that climate change is not happening. I mean, there's tons of science on that. Those people will probably never change their mind. I mean, they're not accepting the science for whatever reason. I don't know what their motivations are. I think with parenting, there's very personal motivations. I was raised this way, and I raised my child this way, and I don't want to be questioned, and I want to believe that my parents did the right thing, and I want to believe that I did the right thing.
Yes.
And those are very emotional, value-laden things that are very hard to, I don't want to criticize anybody's parents. I mean, I think the seatbelt example, I don't criticize my parents for not putting me in a seatbelt. They didn't know any better. They didn't even have the tools. So I don't think my parents were bad parents, but now that they are grandparents, they put their kids in seatbelts. I mean, they have changed their behavior, and I'm not going to repeat their mistakes just because I can, just because they did it. I'm learning from them. I'm learning from the science, and changing my behavior. Even if it sometimes seems like, I mean, in a seatbelt, that doesn't really go against values necessarily, although there's some people that think that they have the individual right not to wear a seatbelt. But, I think people have the same belief about spanking. They have an individual right to do this.
Yes.
But
well, there's the research. I remember talking to Dr. Murray Strauss, and he said, smoking was the same way, because he was a smoker.
Yeah. Right.
He was a spanker and a smoker, and then he had to give them both up. But he said, I liked smoking, and I don't think parents would say I like spanking, but they would feel like, hey, you take that away from me, I'm already struggling, or like, what are you giving me instead? And so in a way, but there was science then too. But the science I've heard for the smoking is very similar to the kind of science we have looking at spanking.
Oh, yeah.
It's correlative. Can you kind of help us understand how they're the same? Because people don't question smoking anymore, even though they still do it.
Right, exactly. But there was a time when there was several decades where the research existed, but people still questioned it. And so it is similar in that it's correlational. We can't randomly assign people to smoke or not. In the lab, they did with animals, of course. They randomly assigned mice to get, smoke inhalation or something like that. We can't really do that with people and discipline. But what we can do in the science is, as I said before, we can do these longitudinal studies and use lots of control variables to say, okay, we're going to take out all these other variables that could be related to both spanking and to kids' behavior, so we can isolate as much as possible the link between spanking at one time and a change in a child's behavior. If we see a change in the behavior and we can link it to spanking, that's the best evidence we have that spanking is actually the cause of it. We can never absolutely rule it out, right. But what I would say is there's no evidence in the other direction. There's no evidence showing that spanking is related to better outcomes. And so
that should tell you something right there. It's
I mean, I've looked, and so to get to that question of being liberal, I'm sorry to talk over you, but
no, it's okay.
I mean, the data that we have put every single study that we looked at in our paper. All the effect sizes, the statistics are there, so anyone can check what we did, and I expect people will. So we're not hiding anything. This is not. We don't have an axe to grind. I mean, we feel strongly about this issue. That's why we spent several years studying it.
Yes.
We were open to seeing. I mean, I actually didn't think we would find such consistent results. I thought, well, we'll find a couple things, but it's so amazingly consistent. It's just,
stunning, really.
Yeah, I mean, and anybody could redo the same analysis and they would find the same thing.
Yeah. So it's not like, it's peer reviewed, and it's been looked at by many, many others that don't have a liberal bias. I don't know that you do or don't, but that's the beauty.
I think I do. I think people would say that I do. I'm in print saying people shouldn't hit their children, so I think that that qualifies. And I say that because I've studied it for 20 years, and
and it's influenced you, right?
I'm so tired of reading all the ingenious ways people hit and hurt their children. I just did a study, a review of research on corporal punishment in schools around the world, and it is just horrifying. It is horrifying the things people do to children in this country as well. In this country, people hit children with boards in school. I mean, it is really beyond, anything that I can understand.
And they believe it's the right thing to do. Right. They're not doing it necessarily out of being overwhelmed. They really believe it's the right thing to do. And I think that there's pervasive irritation with children and their behavior, and a lot of negative responses to this research saying that we really do want to control children with violence. And I'm wondering, can you say something about I study trauma, and part of how I got interested in spanking was I was I somehow started to see the correlation in terms of outcomes, and looking at that, I began to realize, my gosh, spanking is an impingement, particularly in early development, on later ongoing development that concerned me. But I'm always interested in transgenerational transmission, the transmission of trauma, and I'm wondering if there's a similar phenomena with spanking, if the shame that the parent feels that they're putting into the child through spanking is being transmitted. What do we know from the science about this generational sort of transmission of this idea?
Well, we definitely know that physical punishment is intergenerational. If somebody's parents spank them, they're much more likely to spank their own children. We don't know actually about kind of the emotional motivations for that, other than people just thinking that it works and thinking that it's necessary. Yeah. And those are beliefs they got from their parents, probably, or from their cultural group or some other source. But I can't speak to the shame or kind of emotionally laden part of it. It's mostly when you ask people why they do it, it's usually something to do with it worked for me, or my parents did it to me and I turned out okay, and it's necessary, and the Bible tells me so, and those kind of
reasons. And that's kind of it. Yeah. So and it's really interesting because I wondered, in terms of, usually with research like what you've got here, and it's gone wild. I've seen it in the main media. I've seen it in New Zealand. I mean, this is getting picked up all over the place. So what you're talking about is a stunning message. And I'm wondering if there's any, usually there's a policy issue or a suggestion, like, okay, so what do we do? As parents, we know we should stop, but also as citizens of a country that loves their children, what should we be doing, and what are the implications? I had just been reading this report. It's called the Global Peace Index, and it's essentially, there's two kinds of peace. There's peace that's called negative peace, and negative peace is that you have it and then you don't, and then you have it, you don't. And if you think about that, that's true of certain countries. It's probably also true of certain families. Like, today was a good day, the next day is a terrible day, and it's not sustainable. But then there's this other concept called positive peace, and positive peace tends to lend to sustainable peace over time. So you don't get these huge kind of fluctuations in the peace index. And what they're finding is that there's 8 kind of key pillars that contribute to countries having a positive peace index, and one of them is the acceptance of human rights of its citizens. And it's interesting because I was looking at it, and the top 20, the big cluster of them have banned spanking or are in beginning to do so, and the lowest, the most volatile and negative peace countries have absolutely no protection of children, far even beyond the spanking. And I'm just wondering what you would say about, what does this research tell us in terms of the direction that policy should be going in this country?
Well, so again, the research is, even though it's correlational, it's very consistent, and so at a certain point we have to just agree that this is what the research says.
Yeah.
And so the United Nations has decided that, based on this research and based on human rights arguments, that spanking should be banned in all countries and no one should be allowed to hit children. And as you say, 49 countries have banned all physical punishment of children. And so, the argument has gone beyond the research around the world. In the United States, we're starting to see some of those arguments. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, released a report 2 weeks ago in which they said that the research is strong enough that we need to have public education campaigns about why people should not spank and hit their children. And we should probably have legislation. So we now have the federal government saying that education is necessary and possibly legislation. I think we are far away from legislation in the United States of parents' use of corporal punishment. I hope that we are closer to legislation on corporal punishment in schools, because even though we're talking about parents today, it's still legal in 19 states for school personnel to hit children, and they usually do so with objects like big paddles.
Yes.
And so that legislation has been introduced in Congress year after year, and so it's there again. I don't know what it doesn't look like it has very good chances of passing right now, but it's still 200,000 kids a year are being hit in school. So that's something where I think most American surveys have shown most Americans don't actually think people should be hitting kids in school.
Right.
It's a line
between, of course, right? It's regional. And the paddling are in regions where spanking is actually supported by parents, not just schools. And largely the African American community is hit a lot. I'm wondering, from a research perspective, because we know that there's particular issues in the African American communities around fearing the establishment, fearing your children doing things that would get them in trouble with the law. There's a different experience being an African American in this country. And so I'm wondering if the research says anything about the way that, is it different for African Americans when they use spanking, because they're using it in a different way towards survival and trying to cope in their specific situation.
Right, so that argument is used a fair amount. The people who are in a threatening environment use spanking because they think that the consequences of not obeying parents are so severe in a harsh environment that parents use harsh punishment. But unfortunately, that's not been borne out in the research. So I did a study where we looked at 11,000 children throughout the United States, and we looked at African American children, white children, Latino children, and Asian American children. And we found that indeed African Americans do spank more than those other three groups. But when we take that into account and we look over time to see, okay, is spanking predicting more behavior problems or less behavior problems? Is it working in some of these groups and not others? We find absolutely no difference. Spanking predicts more aggression across all those four groups the same. So the message to me is, yes, there are differences by race, ethnic, or cultural group in how often people spank, but there's no difference in the effect on the children.
Right.
And that goes against arguments about cultural normativeness. I don't know if you've heard that kind of.
Yeah.
It kind of is this argument that a certain behavior will be less harmful if it's in an environment where it's the norm.
It's not personal. My friends get hit. Everyone in my neighborhood
that's what happens to you when you misbehave. You get hit.
Right.
And that research, at least this study and several other studies like it done by people other than myself, have found that also. So that we don't find research that's supporting that cultural normative idea.
Okay, well, that's really useful. And it also kind of brings up the whole issue of, well, we already know Black Lives Matter, right? Mm-hmm. And we know we should be doing things to help the African American community, to support them. And yet there's really no educational campaign to support them in alternatives. And there's no educational campaign that I'm aware of that's even promoting your research and helping people make sense of it. Because, you see a lot of research hit the news, and it doesn't always make sense as to, well, okay, is this a big research, or is it just a little minor thing, or average people we don't always know. So it seems like the educational piece of it is pretty important. Do you know Have you looked at any of the research, I know beyond this meta-analysis that you've done, where ending spanking or prohibiting it or increasing education has any effect on, well, decreasing spanking, I'd be interested, but also, I mean, there is an argument that things are worse now because we don't spank and that we took paddling out of schools. So is there any research to show that, in fact, if you do eliminate spanking, that you have more peaceful communities? Is this going to contribute to greater peace?
Yes, so I can talk about some research on each one of those things. So there have been several studies of interventions that have a goal of reducing spanking as a way of increasing children's good behavior. And so one is called the Incredible Years program, which was created by Carolyn Webster Stratton in Seattle. It's a very well-known, well-used program. And it's geared towards children with conduct problems and their families. And one big component of that is teaching parents how to behave, well, how to discipline their children in a positive way and not to use physical punishment. And the program is very successful, and one of the ways they found it successful is by reducing spanking. So by reducing parents' use of spanking, there's this link with less problem behavior. So that study has found that. I have found a similar thing looking at the Head Start program. So this is a study I published a couple weeks ago as well. We found that parents in Head Start spank less over time compared to parents who are not in Head Start, because Head Start is a two-generational program. We think of it as preschool for kids, but there's also a component for parents. Yeah. And so parents in Head Start spank less over time, and then their children are behaving in a better way, less aggressively over time as a result of that lower spanking. So we have these kind of experimental studies, and those are both experiments where they have random assignment. And so those give us some stronger evidence that if you do decrease spanking, you're going to get a positive outcome in the end. As far as, there's also a study of the Triple P program. And so that program is designed to be what we call multi-tier intervention. So it educates people at an individual level, but it also educates communities. And there was a study of it in South Carolina where they did big public service announcements on radio and bulletin boards talking about the harm of hitting children. And they found that in those counties where they had that program, physical abuse rates dropped. So they didn't have rates of spanking necessarily, but they had rates of physical abuse, and they dropped in those counties where they had this education campaign.
Wow.
So these
just making parents aware.
I think that's what it is. It's just giving people a reason to think about it and try to do something else instead of hitting, and try to giving some kind of negative valence to hitting. That we shouldn't just accept it. We should question it. Yes. And I think that kind of campaign is good at doing that. And then one other thing I can tell you about is I did a study of corporal punishment in schools, and looking across different states, finding that the states that banned corporal punishment over a 20-year period did not see an increase in juvenile crime. There was no increase in any kind of juvenile crime. So taking corporal punishment away from the schools does not lead into worse behavior in those states. And so, I get that argument a lot. Oh, kids are so much worse behaved now than they were in the past. You can find people saying that for thousands of years. People have been
They're even voting it back in some of the southern states. They're voting it back in. So, but your research is showing that, in fact, removing it from schools does create a safer environment, it sounds like, for children.
Yeah, and that particular study was looking at the state level. So we can't know for sure which states, or it's schools. But overall, it looks like there's no negative impact of taking corporal punishment out, because that's one of the arguments I hear is if we take it out, kids are going to go wild, and we're going to have all this juvenile crime, and they're going to be wild in the streets, and that's just not true.
Yeah, in fact, the big fear that you see, it's one of those memes that went viral, was if there was more of this and you see a picture of spanking a young child, there'd be less of this, and you get a picture of teenagers that they're sort of looking like, I don't know, hoodlums. They just look like teenagers to me, but you know what I mean? Teenagers with an attitude. But the idea that, seriously, the attitude is that, listen, we have juvenile delinquency and disrespectful teenagers and all of this, and it's because we've taken away spanking. That's the biggest fear, right?
Yeah, and that is so absolutely not true for two reasons. One is that the rate of spanking has been constant for the last few years. It's been, pretty much everybody still spanks. 85% of parents still spank their children. So the vast majority of kids are spanked. So there's been no change in spanking to account for any change in kids' behavior overall.
We're just afraid there's been a change.
Right, but actually what the change has been a positive one. Since 1993 was the top rate of juvenile crime in the United States. So that was kind of in the crack epidemic. There was a lot of juvenile crime.
What
Since
year was
then,
it?
1993.
93,
This
right.
is data from the Department of Justice.
Yes.
And they have these graphs showing that since 1993, in 1994, there's been a huge drop in juvenile crime. So kids have gotten, by that extreme measure, kids have gotten better behaved. They're not engaging in these very extreme forms, even while spanking has stayed the same over time. So spanking's not, I mean, I guess spanking's not related to the improvement in that either, but it's not related to any kind of worsening in children's behavior by that kind of extreme measure.
Yes. Okay. So I'm Amy.
We have one other question that I would love for y'all to speak to.
Yeah.
Erin asks, she said, I would love to hear your opinion on cognitive dissonance. Do you think that applies to parents who were spanked as children?
I definitely do. That's an excellent question. So cognitive dissonance is this idea that you kind of reframe in your mind an experience that you had that was negative, but you think it led to something positive, so you kind of reframe it as a good thing. And so you kind of, you know, they talk about this in like hazing. So when fraternity members haze each other, and like, why would you do anything so terrible to somebody else if you hated it so much? But it's this, they have this dissonance, like, well, I survived and I made it through okay, but now I'm going to do it to the next people because it was done to me.
Right.
And I think that actually is part of what we're seeing in physical punishment, is we're trying to rationalize it happened to us, or we have done it to our children. We're trying to rationalize, well, it must be okay because here I am, I survived, and so I'm just going to keep doing it. It's not the only reason, but I think that it's something that people are not conscious of. It's hard to get at that kind of consciously. But I fear that is one of the reasons why people are continuing to spank, even if they do know that it's not necessarily good for children.
Because it's like essentially how they coped with the distress in the first place.
Yeah, they're just
sort of like it's a mending or it's a protection for them in a way.
Right.
That attitude protects them from.
Right, and they're motivated to believe their parents were good, right? I mean, we all want to think that our parents did the right thing by us and that we as parents are doing the right thing.
Yes.
And so whatever behavior we do, we kind of fit into that mold. Like, I'm a good parent, so this behavior must be good, and this behavior must be good. Or, so we kind of rationalize it all to make ourselves kind of a coherent person.
Right, and it kind of protects the attachment to our parents, which is like really attachment to life, I think, particularly in your childhood. It's like that's it's core.
Now, obviously, in extreme forms, I've heard from lots of people who say when their parents use very harsh discipline, that damaged the relationship irreparably, like they could not get back. And so at a certain level, you get past that dissonance and you recognize the harm. And I think people who recognize the harm then don't do it to their own children. But they probably have to recognize the harm in themselves a little bit first, which is somewhat hard to do because you're trying to say, I'm a good person, I'm okay. Everyone likes to say that they're okay.
I want to say that.
I'll survive. Here we are. We made it to adulthood. Great for us.
Yeah.
But I like to tell people that I think we made it out okay in spite of spanking, not because of it. I think that we became good people, or at least survived, because our parents taught us all the important lessons that we needed to learn about why we need to share and why we need to take turns and why you don't hurt other people, why you don't steal, and whether those lessons came from them telling us or from religion or wherever those lessons came from.
Yeah.
That's why we are good people. That's why we're okay. It's not because we were hit. It's because of all these other lessons.
Yes. Well, and in communities where part of love means to honor your parents and to have a deep sense of respect for them, it isn't always clear how to question certain behaviors they had while also sustaining a deep respect for them and for the context also. It's historical. Our parents didn't raise us in this era. They raised us in a different era. And I'm wondering if there is a way, I don't know if you've spent much time speaking with religious groups, but we know that religious ideology does in large part, particularly in the South, drive this belief and shuts the door to science. And I'm wondering, is there a way for, like, how would you see science opening a door to engage with the religious community? Is there a bridge there?
That's a really interesting question. I think the bridge is going to have to come from the religious community. I mean, it's hard. I can't challenge people's religious beliefs. I mean, that's not my job. My job is to show data and what, and I think science is a beautiful thing, and I think something that we can use to make our world a better place. And we've improved our lives so tremendously over the last several thousand years by using science and learning. There are some religious organizations that have started to challenge physical punishment and challenge the belief that the Bible supports spanking. So the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church have both passed resolutions saying that parents should not physically punish their children, that it goes against teachings of protecting children, and treating them as precious. I'm not a religious person, but I was raised in a religious home and read the Bible a fair amount, and I know that in the New Testament, Jesus never talked about hitting children and talked about protecting them. And if that's the message people want to live by, then to be consistent, treating children as special and as vulnerable and in need of protection.
Yes.
Hurting them by hitting them kind of goes against that.
It does. I wonder if, in a way, I'm hoping that this conversation we've had today can strengthen people whose real wisdom is in the religious arena, that they can really speak to their whether it's Muslim or Christian or whatever the religious orientation is, they can speak to their community from their embodied experience. And I think I have a girlfriend who she is very supportive. She quoted some of your work in a paper she recently wrote, and she's a lovely person. She's in a Christian community, and she tells me, I have to share the research, and she wants to understand the research, but she also shares narrative and story, which I think is the genius of the religious community, is that it's not just about facts and data, it's about what it feels like. And one of the stories she shares is Astrid Lindgren, when she talked about the mother that said, go out and get a stick or a vine to, I'm going to hit you. And I know a lot of people might think that, well, people didn't do that, but they really did. My grandmother would go out and get a switch off the peach tree for her mother. That was part of the process. Well, in this story, I don't know if you've heard this story, but the boy goes out and he's looking and he's looking and he comes back with a rock. And his mom says, why did you bring me a rock? And he goes, I couldn't find a switch, just throw this at me.
Oh.
And my girlfriend is telling this story to her beloved family member, and they're very touched. So, and they begin to understand, that it's also, what do we believe? What are these beliefs doing? And so I think the science can support, but always there's this way of where's the narrative and the connection and the relationship and the conversation, right?
Yeah, somebody told me an interesting anecdote yesterday of a child living in California who her mom was going to spank her, and the child said, my body is my own and no one may touch it without my permission. And the mother was like, oh, wow, you're right. Because the child had been learning that in school, as part of an abuse prevention initiative in the school, but the kid brought it home to the parent, and so the parent had to go, oh, right,
that's interesting.
That is a lesson that I need to learn too.
Yeah, I think that's the idea that Sweden had when they put the information about not spanking on the little milk carton, that you're having your cereal and your kid is talking about it.
Right. I mean, I think it's important for children to learn their rights as well. And we have a long way to go in this country to do that. But other countries have been much more successful. Sweden is, of course, a great example. But these little examples show me children pick up on these lessons, and when they're getting conflicting lessons from two different sources that they both trust, it's hard for them to figure out. So they're going to bring one home to the other, and then they're trying to put them together. And so as parents, we want them to learn a consistent message.
And it's wonderful, really, because, when my child brings me something, I don't feel like I've got the eyes of culture shaming me and judging me. It's a private thing. I had a friend once tell me, he says, give me the research, but don't talk to me about it. I'll read it. I'll let you know. But because because he is such a kind person, but he was raised in a culture that shamed, and you had to be the right person and a good person. So for him, it's agonizing to think he might have been harmful. So he wants to sort of keep it to himself and read it and think about it, and then get there. So there's a lot of trust to let this message in. And I think when children can say, hey, I learned from school that this and that, the parent's not quite so challenged as the neighbor saying it, or
right. Right, or me saying it.
Right, or that liberal bias.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And I do want to say, though, I tease you that way, but your meta-analysis is looking at massive bodies of research that are not done by you, that don't carry, that this is really the beauty of science, is that it has this kind of neutral perspective. I know we're coming close to the hour. Amy, is there anything that you've been hearing that we need to address? And
I don't see anything left. You all spoke to everybody's concerns, all the things that they are sort of coming up against in their own advocacy. I think y'all really spoke to all of it. Lots of people are just really thrilled to be here and hearing this information. I think they feel encouraged, and so I don't see anything. Lots of thank yous.
That's great.
I just wanted to say, for those of you listening, if you're looking for some Christian resources for why not to spank, L.R. Nost wrote Jesus the Gentle Parent, and Samuel Martin wrote Why Not Train a Child. Both of those are, L.R. Nost's book is available at Amazon and other places, and Samuel Martin's book is available online as a free e-download, and you could just Google Why Not Train a Child, and you can download it there. So there's just some great resources.
Well, Dr. Gershoff, thank you so much for your time that you've given us. Is there any closing remarks you'd like to make? Anything that comes to mind that you'd like to say before we end?
No, I'm very encouraged that people are interested in the topic and willing to kind of reconsider this method. I don't think that we have damaged a whole generation of children. I think that we have a chance to, make better with the children and learn from this research. There are many other ways to discipline children that don't involve hitting, and that we should be trying those methods as much as we can and educating ourselves.
Yeah, it's like the research, it doesn't have to be a shaming message to make parents feel bad. It can be just more information that we can grow as a culture together to move more towards peace, I think.
That would be lovely.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. This is, a growing movement, and we're excited that so many people really want to learn more and help more people and reach out. And I'm super thrilled about the research. I think this is exactly what we need, just to say, let's find some alternatives. Let's really show our children we love them by the way we discipline them, because we know that's what every parent's goal is, really, to do what's best for them and finding out those best things in many of the ways Dr. Gershoff said today. The research is really pointing it out and making it clear that spanking's not it. So there's lots of resources for anyone who wants to stop spanking and begin to move away from there. You can visit Robbyn at stopspanking.org. You can visit me at Parenting Beyond Punishment. And you can contact any of us. There's just lots of people out there ready and willing to help you right where you are right now. So thank you for being here. Yes, go ahead.
I wanted to say one other thing for anyone that might use this video to address schools in the South where this is still happening. Livesinthebalance.org is a wonderful program that can be implemented in schools as an alternative to using corporal punishment.
Oops. Yes, thank you so much, Robbyn.
Yeah.
And thank you all for being here. Bye.
Bye. Bye.